We're joined now by a great friend of our broadcast, U.S. Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma. And Senator Lankford, now as the White House is categorizing this as an invasion of Ukraine, they changed the language from to invasion specifically. And now we're looking at two pieces of legislation you were supporting. One is the Never Yielding Europe's Territory Act that you're a co-sponsor on. The second is specific to Belarus and any other countries that would support the Russian aggression. I want to start there because Belarus is playing an important role in this because they've allowed Russian troops to basically occupy Belarus to utilize potentially for an invasion of other areas in Ukraine, not just the eastern parts of Ukraine. So tell people about specifically the legislation and sanctions focused on Belarus.
Yeah, the key thing here is to be able to make sure this is not just a focus on Russia, but if you're invading Ukraine or facilitating the invasion of Ukraine, you also face sanctions here. So I've tried to make it very, very clear. Well, a lot of people have been focusing on Russia, rightly so. These are Russian troops that are moving into eastern Ukraine even right now. If they are planning to be able to move in on Kyiv from the north, that's through Belarus. That's Belarus facilitating it. Belarus right now doing joint exercises with the Russians. They're preparing the way for the Russians to be able to actually move in. They should face the same kind of sanctions that Russia is facing. Even if their troops don't cross the border, they're still facilitating the process.
Senator Lankford, there was supposedly these joint exercises, military exercises between Ukraine and Russia were supposed to have stopped about 3 or 4 days ago, and they haven't, as you've reported. As you stated, I want to ask you this question, though, as we look at this. Vladimir Putin gave a very nationalistic and expansive speech yesterday prior to putting in, quote, peacekeeping troops into the two regions of Ukraine. Now, putting in those troops violates international law because those are the recognized borders of Ukraine and violated the Minsk agreement. Where do you see this playing out at this point? What do you think is the next move here?
Yeah, hard to be able to tell what Putin's going to do. Obviously, he's done quite a bit of social media noise and just deception, both in Ukraine and in Russia, to be able to say it's the Ukrainian people that are actually causing all these problems, and the Russians are having to cross borders to be able to help protect the Russian speakers in those areas. They've continued to be able to run with that false narrative over and over again. And so we can clearly see his intention is to be able to take over all of eastern Ukraine and to make what they've tried to assume as the fact they take this over simply by saying they speak Russian, so they should be in the Russian area. This would be like Mexico saying parts of southern Texas speak Spanish, and so we're just going to take those parts over. That's not how it works. These are international recognized borders, and they can't just move in to be able to do that. Now, how far he continues to go, our assumption is if the Ukrainians push back and attack, which they should obviously respond to be able to protect their country, then Russia will then move into the rest of the country and say the Ukrainians provoked us as we're trying to protect other Russians. So right now, clearly, Putin is trying to provoke a larger scale war.
Yeah, Senator Lankford, you introduced this Belarus Aggression Accountability Act. Are you getting bipartisan support, and you're starting to see some senators unite around this, that maybe this could get to President Biden's desk?
Yeah, we have actually. We've had very strong bipartisan support. This is one of those pieces that once I put it out there, we had people on both sides of the aisle saying, okay, that makes total sense. Why haven't we already addressed this as well? We shouldn't just focus on Russia. We should also focus on Belarus and their activities and engaging with Ukraine as well.
You know, you pointed out in the statement that you issued on the push for these sanctions on Belarus that 30,000 troops are near the Belarus-Ukraine border. It's the largest deployment to Belarus since the Cold War, and that additionally, Russia, of course, has the 130,000. Now reports could be 170,000 or more troops on the other portions of the border. Belarus is a bad actor here, and that's what you're focusing on. And for our audience, will you explain the strategic significance of Belarus as it relates to what Vladimir Putin's doing, where it plays an essential role if they were to take this kind of military action?
Sure. Yeah, there are a lot of folks that have heard on the news that Ukraine is surrounded on three sides. They're not surrounded on three sides by Russian troops in Russia. Those Russian troops have moved into Belarus, which is on the north, and they're now prepared to be able to move to the south. If you're on the border of Belarus, Ukraine, you're within a half day's drive to Kyiv, the capital city. So it is very significant to be able to have Russian troops active, armed, prepared, doing all their war games in preparation to be able to move in on Kyiv. But the other thing that people forget is, as a NATO ally, they're not only a half a day's drive from Kyiv at that point, if they're in Belarus, They're also a half-day drive from Warsaw, Poland, in that same spot as well. So it's very significant for Russian troops to be able to move in there. They're literally right on the border, facing off on NATO as well as looking south towards Ukraine and Kyiv.
Yeah, it was interesting because yesterday Vladimir Putin mentioned Poland when he talked about the territories that were Russian-controlled. So
yeah, and the mistakes made by Russian leaders post-World War II. I mean, he was talking about mistakes made in the 1970s, mistakes made in post-World War II, and mistakes made in the 1960s and 70s. Now, one of those issues, though, because you've also are a co-sponsor of the Never Yielding Europe's Territory Act. This goes back to, again, we have agreements dating back to 1994 that guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty. That's because, and that is when Ukraine denuclearized. They got rid of their nuclear weapons and their nuclear arsenal. There are Ukrainian politicians saying maybe today they wish they didn't do that because Vladimir Putin would never have invaded a sovereign country that had nuclear weapons pointed at Russia. But that's not reality anymore. But you've got these sanctions that would be ready to go in place. And because I want to explain to people, we saw the pause by the Germans, and I know this legislation directly relates to that. So the pause on the certification of Nord Stream 2, this would go, your sanctions that you're co-sponsoring, specifically to Nord Stream 2, would go into effect if the Germans lifted that pause.
Well, correct. And we're trying to engage with what's called primary and secondary sanctions. This is what we're doing to Iran, what the listeners on this show are very familiar with. Primary and secondary sanctions mean we not only sanction Iran, but we sanction everybody that does business with Iran to be able to make it very clear. You either do business with Iran or the United States of America. We are the largest economy in the world. What we're proposing is also that same effect on Russia as well, that you can either do business with Russia or the United States, but definitely not both. So we do primary sanctions on Russia. We do secondary sanctions on anyone who does business with Russia. And people can't lose track of this one key fact. Russia's economy is a tiny economy. What Putin has done to Russia is astronomical for the effect for their actual economy and how much destruction he's really made. Russia has a smaller GDP, gross domestic product, than the state of Texas has. So while Russia is geographically a very large country, they're actually a very small economy. They're basically a gas station that's selling oil and natural gas to Europe and to Asia and whoever wants to be able to buy it. If we cut that off, Russia's economy collapses and Putin faces real consequences.
Back on your Belarus Aggression Accountability Act, you said the bill would make no distinction between the Russian Federation and any other government, including Belarus there, that aids or assists Russian forces in any acts of military aggression that violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. I said earlier, Senator, that there's international law recognizing these Ukrainian boundaries. And Vladimir Putin has already said, he announced it yesterday and took action by placing, quote, peacekeeping troops in these two regions of Ukraine. How significant do you view that move by Putin as it came literally on the heels of his speech?
Yeah, it is very significant. Obviously, it was well planned. He's prepared for this. Those troops are moving in from the east, from Russia. They've not moved in from Belarus at this point. We pray that they never do and head towards Kyiv. But it's a very significant moment for them to be able to literally cross the border. In the past, and Russians have been in that area since 2014. Remember, it was a Russian surface-to-air missile that shot down the airliner in 2014 from that same area. The Russians have been there, Russian troops have been there, but they've always just called them separatists, and they've said they were rebels and all of those things. They've not been willing to admit it. Now the Russians are moving into those areas, declaring them as independent states, and then saying that those states have also invited them to set up military enclaves. So while the Russians are moving in, they're looking to set up shop, drive out everyone who's Ukrainian from that, and take those areas over from their neighbor from Ukraine.
Senator Lankford, I think, as you said, there's wide bipartisan support for these kind of sanctions on Russia and on the actors like Belarus who are aiding and abetting Russia in this aggression. My question for you is, do we still have time for sanctions like this to maybe prevent a full-scale invasion of Ukraine where Kyiv falls, the government falls, et cetera? Is there still time for that kind of pressure, to get that kind of pressure on Putin?
I pray so. This was something that I even had some Democrat colleagues in the Senate that said we need to go ahead and step up and pass. The Biden administration was trying to be very, very slow and, quote unquote, careful on this. They didn't want to provoke a war. And so they were being very tentative in this process in the days leading up. My statement all along has been it is much easier to try to prevent a war from ever starting than to stop a war once it's actually begun. So we need to do everything we can to engage to try to prevent this, to make sure that Putin and Belarus and any other country that would cooperate with them to attack Ukraine understands the international consequences of that and would give them pause before they actually cross that border. Even more, I would tell you, this is not a minor incursion, as Biden said early on, that they would wait and see what happens with a minor incursion. When you cross a border into another country of military force, no one considers that minor if it's your own country. This is a full-on invasion that's happening in the eastern part of the country right now.
Senator Lankford, thank you for spending the time with us. Let me encourage our audience right now. Call your senator. Tell them to support these two pieces of legislation, the Never Yielding Europe's Territory Act and the sanctions on Belarus. They're all those offices will know exactly what you're talking about. And I want to thank Senator Lankford for spending the full segment with us, walking through what Congress is trying to do to get around the Biden administration's lack of action.